Now close your eyes.
Hi, I'm Dr. Pachari, and we're back for another episode of the Prognosis, which is a palliative podcast. Today, we're speaking about death and spirituality. I have three wonderful guests with me today, and let me go ahead and introduce them, and then we can get into the conversation right away. On my left, I have Dr. Debra Walters. She is a professional grief expert who works with awareness, needs, and spiritual care and grief support. She is a collaborative consultant on challenging cases for other professional colleagues. She has served and aided her own clientele to find healing after loss. And in the work of educational enrichment and bereavement support programs, Dr. Deb has offered specialized retreats and seminars. She is the author of 2 books, Living Boldly and Dying Well, and a forthcoming book, which should be in the summer of 2021, which is called Generous Grief. She is available for one-on-one support and for those in need of grief counseling. A little more on Dr. Deb and her illustrious career. She has been a corporate chaplain and psychosocial support trainer. She holds degrees in social work, seminary training, and a doctorate in grief impacts on the human spirit. She attended Florida State University and Mercer University, the McAfee School of Theology. And in 2020, after a decade of studying the Enneagram, became certified in this psychosocial spiritual tool. Since 1979, she has remained focused on her calling and passion for a healthier self-soul awareness that offers a life of respectful regard for the grief and gratitude moments that offer an authentic life in holistic balance. She can be reached at debwalters2005@gmail.com. That's Dr. Deb.
Thank you.
Welcome. On my right, we have Stanley Samuel. He is an ordained or has been an ordained clergyman for over 25 years, with over 10 of those years recently as a hospice chaplain. He operates from the basic principle that all human beings have a spark of divinity, are worthy of dignity and respect, and deserve to be loved. His satisfaction as a spiritual care provider comes from learning from the life experiences of those he meets, whether they are a person of faith or otherwise. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
And my last, but not least, my last guest to introduce is Reverend Dr. Nancy Penton. She is a board-certified chaplain with the Association of Professional Chaplains. She completed the Doctor of Ministry in Christian Spirituality from the McAfee School of Theology in December 2013. She has served as an adjunct professor at McAfee since the fall of 2013, teaching classes in spiritual formation and spiritual discernment. Nancy has an ecclesial endorsement for chaplaincy from the Association of Vineyard Churches. She served as a director of spirituality and hospice liaison in a skilled nursing facility in Atlanta from 2009 until she retired in 2019. She continues to mentor chaplains. She serves on chaplain board certification committees and maintains an active spiritual direction practice. She enjoys traveling, camping, and experiencing the beauty of our national parks. Welcome.
Thank you.
Very nice to have you all here. I am going to jump right into the discussion because I have such great guests. And the first question that I wanted to pose to the panel, and we'll just talk openly, is why do we die from a spiritual perspective? Is there a spiritual meaning to death and dying?
Yes, there is, I believe, a spiritual perspective because we are spiritual beings. Essentially, every human being is in this physical form, which the physiological condition of the body is a decaying matter. And the spiritual being has to be released at some point. So death in itself is a spiritual process that's occurring.
No, I concur. None of us birthed ourselves. We made no choice to get here. So it's actually a gift to even be able to be alive. And I think as we move through the journey of all the different stages that the human being, divine spiritual being, goes through, right, Stanley? It allows us to see that death is actually still a part of the living, too. So we go through different stages as we go along our lifespan, and we experience death along the way, losses that we say goodbye to, and we know that we are going to be a part of that journey as well. So how do we do that well? That's the key for us spiritually, is how do we really do that well?
With that, actually, that brings up a question. If we consider it a spiritual process, is it a positive spiritual process to die? Is it a negative spiritual process? You were saying liberation. A lot of people perceive death as a negative. So if it is a spiritual process and something that people, get to a higher point of being afterwards or something more, is it actually a positive process in your minds?
So in a sense, yes, one should be looking forward to dying, but the reality is none of us is. I'm not. So that reality remains. And the reason for that reality, in my understanding, is the unknown factor of timing of these things, including birth, but especially death. Once we're born, we may be destined to die, but we don't know when. And so all the preparations, people say, I think we're ready, we're ready, but we're never ready. We're preparing, but we're never ready when the time comes. So even though it should be a positive event that we should look forward to, because we are not ready in that sense of the unknown of the time, all of that preparation still is just so hard to look forward to something that we don't know about. And that's why, even though it should be a positive experience, it sometimes is not. I say sometimes because one can attain to that, I believe that.
How does one attain that? How does one, if you have an unknown and you're frightened of dying, but it is a positive, how do you move more in the direction of embracing your mortality, of seeing that as a positive?
I guess since I brought it up, I must address it as well. Yes, exactly. So they're trying to give me the grace of saying, okay, follow up with your statements. So I guess to me, the essence of that can be found in finding love. Love and acceptance is what we are all looking for as human beings, as spiritual beings. We want to get connected to another spiritual being. The physical aspect distracts us. It causes us to look at physical features, and we either like or don't like some people. And all of those things, kind of the distractions of those physical appearances, cause us not to pursue the spiritual connection that we could attain. Once we attain spiritual connection with beings, even on the roadside, driving by, I bow to the divinity in you. You may be throwing a finger at me, but I bow to the divinity in you, and that is my journey towards spiritual peace. I hope to be beneficial to you as well, yet that is my way of thinking, at least, or making an attempt to journey towards a peaceful end of my life.
I think when you ask that question, for me, there's this chaotic place when it comes to spirituality. And how do we then get it calm? How do we get to a place where life and death can have an ability to be in an equal balance with one another? So as Stanley was just saying, you are a spiritual being walking in a human experience. And I'm always saying occasionally we walk in our human experience and run into a spiritual moment. But when you talk about death and coming into a dying process, is it a car accident that took you out? Is it an illness and a diagnosis that went on for decades? Is it a baby that did not make it to go home in mom and dad's arms? Is it substance abuse issue story? What's the story? So somewhere within the story kind of defines where that spiritual layers are going to end up going. And then in the interconnectedness of that story, how does it ripple into the family? How does it ripple into the friends? How does it leave an impact of a legacy? Was it a suicide? How does that roll out? So spirituality in those kind of death moments then becomes, it's not cookie cutter. It's not a one-size-fits-all answer. Because now everyone's in that chaotic moment of how do they make sense of the death? And where are the spiritual elements that rise up for them because of that experience?
And a lot of our experience as chaplains is dealing with families. Mm-hmm. Yes, we accompany the dying, but we also have experiences with processing the grief and the comfort for families. And so as we look at each of the stories, Deb, that you brought up, you know, the different ways people leave, mm-hmm. the different ways of dying, the different ages and stages and diagnoses, then picking up the pieces with the family and accompanying them through grief and legacy pieces are very important. Mm-hmm. And the role of chaplains to be that peaceful pastoral presence, to bring the calm into the situation, to try to help them make sense. Mm-hmm. What are the places they're grateful for? What are the places they're angry about? What are the places that we can be of service?
Mm-hmm. Very well said, exactly. Because it's not a one-size-fits-all story. Every human being is its own walking story. And that's going to have its spiritual pieces in it that Stanley is alluding to.
That's one of the areas, I wouldn't mind hearing your opinions on this. It's one of the areas I struggled with in my own life where I thought there's an individual realm and then there's a universal realm. There's a universality to dying that almost, it's not cookie cutter, but there's a universality of transitioning or dying. And then, as you said, there are these individual moments where it plays out in a very nuanced fashion. How do we reconcile those? What is the truth? Both are the truth. Which one, you know, because sometimes you can go between both. You can go on a universal level. You can see things from a universal perspective. You know, we talk about mortality, even in this era right now with COVID, you hear numbers and they don't have a meaning. It's just a universal mortality. And then the individual mortality, if you hear about a personal story or what we deal with on a daily basis, a very personalized story. And I find myself vacillating and going, which one has more meaning? Which is the truth? Do we have meaning? Do we not have meaning? And I try to figure that out. So I wouldn't mind hearing what you all think about that aspect.
Well, I think all stories have meaning. Mm-hmm. And on a universal level, we can have community experiences that are the same, national, countrywide, global-wide experiences. But I do think you mentioned COVID, and I do think we're going to see well past another decade. The stories are going to come out. Those numbers are going to turn into stories. And how did they triumph over the tragedy of the loss? We've had that in our own personal family. How are we going to do something and learn something from it? We've done that with World War II stories, Vietnam stories, 9/11 stories. We'll do that with COVID too. And we will find ourselves in the midst of those stories in the interconnected universality that you're speaking to. On a different vein, the way we die is not all that dissimilar, right, Doctor, mm-hmm. to the way we're birthed in. There's actual physicalities that take place to the body that affect the spirit. And so as we're bringing somebody into the world, we're also birthing a soul out of our body into the next realm. So that has its own universalities too. But everyone has a right in their faith tradition and in their ideologies to decide what their good death is going to look like. So that tells my colleagues and I and you, we have to give them the good death they author and want. That's where we've got to meet them where they are.
And that's when we can accompany them. You know, there are times where there's a sudden death and we're not there to accompany.
You've talked about that before too, about giving a good death. Talk more. Let's have a discussion about what is a good death, or are people having, really the whole point of discussing spirituality is as you said, coming to a point where you're maybe a little more readier to embrace aspects of your mortality, recognizing that you're a spiritual being, and knowing that you're going to eventually end up on this sooner or later. And then it brings up the questions are what could be done in terms of creating a good death. So what are some of your thoughts on that?
I have a personal example from my mom, who passed away 2 years ago in hospice care. And for her, a good death was feeling like I was releasing her to go to the next place. And the hospice nurse gave her a wonderful bath that morning. And knowing that she was leaving clean gave her a good death.
That's very intimate, and that's the uniqueness of what good death can mean for each individual. It's great if you can prepare for it, but as Deb said, what kind of death do we experience? We don't know. And have we prepared for it? Sometimes it's so sudden, we can't prepare for it. So good death has to do with, then in that case, as both our colleagues mentioned, the family being supported. And that's where our role comes in, where we are there to help them process through this, to make it a good death, even though there was no preparedness for this particular accident or sudden death that occurred. And getting to that good death place for the family in this case, because the person has already passed away, and they can't per se, have good death or bad death decisions made anymore. But the family can still experience that as a good death in the reminders of, did they love this person, and how was that relationship, and what was the experience of life with this loved one? And if there are any regrets, as one songwriter says, too few to mention. Think on all the other good things that did happen in life. And based on that, get to that point of experiencing it to be a good death.
Actually, I was just thinking of something really quickly when you said good death. I thought what's critical is also, in turn, then to have a good life, right? To get to that place that you're having a good death, and then it brings up what is a good life. I'm sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
No, I agree. I completely agree with that. But I was going along with the storyline. I had a story that rippled into the staff. The patient had a good death. The family had a good death experience with the patient. But the patient chose to not take any medications that would take away her suffering. The nurse and the CNA had a terrible time being able to go in and care for that patient under her wishes that her good death included, don't get me groggy, don't allow me to not be able to communicate, I don't mind suffering. Her disposition was she was Vatican I Catholic, so her faith tradition was very, very much into suffering is not a bad thing. We, in our Western culture, always think any suffering has got to be bad. This particular patient had no issue with suffering. Suffering was an actual part of her daily existence as a human being. So in her spirituality, she had no problem with that piece. So I found that for us as chaplains, you end up spending as much time trying to make a good death that happened here was not such a good death for the staff. So now we chaplains have to help the nurse and the CNA get okay with what the choices were per the family and the patient. So we speak of good death. It has its own complexities, just as we talk about the individualities of our human divine spirit walking in this earth.
Oh,
right?
that is very deep. I was just thinking about what you said, that, from one person's good death can be someone else's tragedy.
It's not a good death.
And then also, really, again, coming back to the individuality, it comes from the person's perspective. And then also bringing up on the suffering. that perspective that I personally, in life know that suffering is a given. Now, we all have different perspectives on to what degree and how do we cope with that. Let's talk a little bit about the good life aspect that I brought up. To have a good death, perhaps you already need to be thinking about or aligning yourself in a spiritual fashion in your life in some way that's going to allow you, if it is sudden or not sudden, to go with the feeling of peace, because that's what you were alluding to, saying peacefulness. What is a good life? And I know this is not it's not a hard and fast, this is a dictate, this is a good life, but what for you all constitutes a good life that would be a preparation to be able to go at any moment?
Well, yeah, it
So
is.
many answers,
Yeah.
but the what do we do with love? How do we receive love? How do we give it away? How do we express our love? Do we feel loved? Do we embrace our belovedness? And if we can embrace our belovedness, then we can share that with others. And it's not a competition then, it's an expression of valuing and appreciating and just making sure the other feels their worth.
It's beautiful. Embracing the belovedness, one's belovedness. And
Yeah, I recently wrote a song that says, "My life is full of love because I give it away." It's not in holding love that you can feel love. It's in giving away. To give is more blessed than to receive. That aspect of when we give love, we feel loved and respond. So, a good life.
No, I concur with what my colleagues are saying. It is really all about how well we really do love our neighbor as we love ourselves. So how do we find the balance in all of that? When we move in the world, how are we living out our lives as our authentic, true selves? No masks, no need to pretend, no competition. We just move in this world with something very spiritual and divine within us that helps us know that we are loved and we can be loved to others, as Nancy's alluded to. So that allows us to be in that peace that passes all understanding, contentment place, that crises don't really rock our boat too hard. Celebrations don't take us to the mountaintop at the level that we think that everything's the next, and got to keep experiencing nothing but great successes and celebrations. A really good life is knowing how to live in the joy of both, and you're not going to be rocked by either one of them and taken down.
is, everything you all say just triggers thoughts. I was thinking about the beloved and the capacity for humans to understand things that other creatures appear not to. Is humanity unique in its spirituality? We think of all creation as being divine, but is there something special about humanity in terms of its spirituality, and then by extent, what we're talking about too, maybe a consciousness or an appreciation of existence, and then mortality, which other other beings may not have?
I'll take that as so. Yes, humanity is different from all other creatures because humanity is the only one that carries a sense of guilt. Animals outside of the human being don't carry guilt. That makes us different. We understand something is right and something is wrong. All other creatures are exempt of it. They are free. They can behave the way they are created to behave. They don't have to pretend. They don't have to, they compete, I know. At the same time, it's not a prideful competition. It's just a survival, instinctual. They don't have to feel guilty about anything. But human beings are different. We feel guilt. we feel remorse, we feel, again, not that perfectly speaking animals don't feel any of these feelings, and yet because we feel these, we then have to come up with a path that we will follow to attain to moksha, to get to that place of mukti or nirvana, where we don't have to feel that guilt and that pain and that sense of punishment anymore. Whereas animals, I believe, truly are just free.
So, yeah, go ahead.
Well, I'm piggybacking off of what Stanley's saying. I think that for us, being created by the divine creator, right? So that divine spark is in us that makes us different from the rest of the animal kingdom. Lions are going to behave like lions, and they're going to look out for their lion pride group. They don't care what the elephants are doing. They're not concerned with the whales in the sea. But with human beings, we have a responsibility that even our divine creator has told us. We have to care for all. So we don't only just look out for our own personal families or our own beloveds that are real close to us. We look out for the greater good of all. That's where the spirituality gets real deep and gets to a place of divinity. So we're not just going to look out for our own. We're going to look out for everyone.
And there's a creativity in humanity that you don't experience in other creatures. There's art, music, and so many other expressions of creativity and being created as humans.
Is
Very well
there
said,
is
yeah.
there a reason you think that, and this might almost be a fanciful question, is there a reason that humanity has been selected out in a way that you can conceive of in your minds? I've asked myself that question too. You know, we're not the dinosaurs, right? Was that one great experiment, and what are we now? You know, we're possibly another fantastic experiment, but is there more to it? Is there a meaning behind that? And I don't know that we'll have the answer, but what do you all think about, you know, because that ties into everything we're talking about, that we're put in place to undergo, as you said, a physical experience as spiritual beings, and then mortality happens. And it's an interesting phenomenon. Is there a meaning above and beyond that? Not just our own mortality, but to the existence of humanity?
For me, I think it is a privilege that God bothered to even make any of us at all. And from my own personal belief with this God that I love and I call a holy one, we have been invited to co-create with that God, co-create in the way we write a book, or co-create in the way we make music, right? Or art, or cook a dinner, or do a garden. We're invited to then tend to others, tend to our families, tend to our patients and our families that we've cared for in our care of hospice work and end of life. Those who are grieving, and they got a dark and difficult story to untangle, sojourn with that person and be able to do that. That makes us different. But I think as Stanley spoke to something instinctual, I think there's something innate in the consciousness piece. We are conscious that there's something bigger than us. And hence why we do have as many faiths across the globe as we have. There is something instinctual that tells us something made that Grand Canyon, something made me, something made Nancy, something's made you, something's made Stanley, and all the different diversities of things that are across this globe came from something that was a master designer. And we are naturally drawn to, how do we then name that God? And oftentimes we do tend to put that God in a box, but at the same time, we're drawn naturally to something that is bigger and bolder and more majestic and beyond us, and we cannot fully name.
On the religion, you were just mentioning religions. So that's a big question I have also with the dying process. Does it help or hinder? That's a pretty loaded question.
Yes.
But, you know, we have, with the diversity of expression of humanity, right, and the individual experience, then from there, over time, the development of religions and ways to try to capture what divinity means and what the meaning is, the individual and the universal meaning. And then from there, by extension, you say, okay, is this helping us? Is this not helping us? I personally have seen instances where it has not helped. I have seen instances where it's been an incredibly powerful moment, which I thought really transcended. So what do you all feel in your experiences with dying patients? Talking a little bit about religion, does that help or hinder? Is religion spirituality in that case or not?
As I said, yes, it helps and it hinders. It's helpful so I always put it in these words: if religion is causing you or leading you, directing you, guiding you towards a healthy spiritual place, peace within, peace with outside, as in with others, then it's helping you. But it hinders when religion causes you to become hateful. When religion, and it does, it can, that is, it causes us to move away from what spiritual health should be or is. Religion is a means to an end. But when religion itself becomes the end, spiritual health cannot be attained. It causes chaos and or turmoil in groups of people, or even within families. Yeah. So it hinders in that sense.
Yeah. And for the dying process, you were going to say, any specifics on that? Like I said, I can think of specific moments where it could be difficult for them to come to a place of acceptance.
Yes, and religion can be very helpful, again, in that regard, where the religious practices that the family and or the individual, the dying person, holds dear, they are able to, pursue those steps. And this can happen only, again, for the dying person, if they are, especially on hospice, where they're at least aware of the imminence of their death. And they can fulfill all of the steps or religious acts that they feel are necessary to get to that place of peace that they're looking to get to. But again, it's a means. Same for the families. If they're religious and the religious steps that they want to, or rituals that they want to perform, are helpful to get to that place of peace, acceptance of death, then it's helpful. But again, religion can hinder, because when religious practices themselves become the focal point, then the disagreements that come out of that are a great hindrance to attain to spirituality or good health.
Yeah. I have so many cases running through my head with that kind of a question.
I was going to ask for a little bit of that, the personal patient experience. I like to hear what people have experienced. So some examples of maybe where you saw.
Two quick cases, but one was with a gentleman who came from a tradition who was not going to come out and give him the Eucharist. He did not want to go through confession to do the Eucharist piece. So he spoke with me. He was Samoan from Hawaii and had been pretty much kicked out of his family, came to the mainland part of the States to live out the rest of his life. He ended up absolutely alone at the end of his life. There was no one, not a child, spouse had already passed, and family in Hawaii had already removed themselves in estrangement. So in that alone place, how do we help him end well with God and himself and within just this little tiny family in the nursing home setting? So I did spend time talking with him, spending time with him, hearing what he needed to say, put his story, hold the witness of the story. And then in that process, I gave him the Eucharist. And he was willing to take it from somebody that he normally would not in his youth have wanted the Eucharist from. Mm-hmm. So somehow in that death story, he transcended the issue of female clergy or Protestant versus Catholic. He transcended all of that and was open to letting me be non-judgmental, and he became less non-judgmental. He found peace, and I stayed with him through the process of dying. So that was a beautiful case that I had a great appreciation for. So I had a second one in my head and it just flew out, so I'm sorry.
Yeah, and I just want to invite us to consider that it may not be either or. Sometimes it's both. And.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And so to make an artificial dichotomy sometimes isn't helpful. So we we can look at the both and of the situations that we encounter and see, yeah, here's the good, here's the belovedness, but maybe this piece wasn't so good. And reconciliation is so important, and reconciliation with self. You know, if there's a self-hatred or an obstacle to forgiving the self for something that they felt was egregious and that they had done, and there's just this place of shame, there's an invitation to and embrace the forgiveness that's available, the peace that's available, the divine washing away of the shame and the guilt and the stain. And so then there can be this entering into an acceptance, as Stanley was talking about, as Deb has articulated so well. We have to come to an acceptance with ourselves of who we are, who we've been called to be, and what we need to do now.
I appreciate that.
Yeah,
Both
I
and.
like that. Yeah. Yeah, that's actually a very good point, that they can be, you know, when you were saying that, I was thinking of a particular case where that was the case, but also, as you were saying, that I encounter that quite often. I think that's one of the biggest points in this world, is a lack of self-love, authentic self-love, and how that hinders us from being able to ultimately find peace within ourselves and towards others. And perhaps, you know, sometimes I've often thought that might be the main goal of existence. You know, if we come in form here, that is the lesson to learn, is an inner love and then an outward expression of that. And that dying is forcing our hand, kind of, and asking us to come to terms with that. How does one come to a place of reconciliation? Is that, you know, that you've mentioned that a few times, that the beloved, and also this. So that might be something to speak to and give some ideas to anyone listening. How does one come to reconciliation? Since that is a very key point probably to preparing for mortality. A very big question. These are all such deep questions.
And I think in your faith tradition, you know, where it's faith and not just religion, then there is that belovedness from the Creator, from God, who doesn't want us to hate ourselves. We're valuable, and we, you know, yes, we may have messed up, but there's a way to accept that, like we're reaching out to say, I receive the love that you intended for me, and I choose to not hate myself anymore. I want to receive your love, and then be able to process through that so that we can give that love away. Sometimes attachments get in the way, unhealthy attachments to different things, and we have to release those attachments to ideas, attachments to people, attachments to misrepresentations of truth, attachments to things that would hinder us from realizing, oh, we are valuable, cherished, and precious.
One of the toughest things that I have in hospice, this is a tough aspect. There are many tough aspects, but one of the difficult ones is getting a younger patient who has done harm to themselves over time, maybe end-stage alcoholism or substance abuse, and knowing that, in a sense, you know, we were talking about mortality that happens, but mortality obviously as a result of self-hatred or self-abuse over years. And that's why I think it's an important message to give to people, that it's very important to work on self-love, trying to find that over time. It's not easy, because we're given such family circumstances, such societal circumstances, such environmental circumstances, that sometimes I marvel that people can come through and pull through and find self-love too. But that's something that I have seen myself where it causes me a lot of grief. And I think, and I always, in those cases, I often think, how can I pull them through, or could we get the education there? But often it really is the damage is done. They are on hospice appropriately at that point. Yeah.
Well, the woundedness usually comes from a story. There's been a trauma. So when somebody's going through a substance abuse issue or a cutting issue that could turn into a suicidal accident moment or whatever, you find yourself in those dark soul injury level stories. Then how it's going to take a specialization of being able to really sojourn with somebody in a very directive way, in a very intentional way, to be able to really help them put some of those soul injury pieces back together and know where all the fragilities are and get stronger, kind of like healing a bone that gets stronger after it's broken. So how do we do that? But that takes a specialization. And I think some chaplains are trained for that and some are not. But I do think that when we spoke about religion earlier in different churches, and Nancy and I have certainly had this conversation before, it would behoove us after COVID for our faith traditions all across the board to start getting a little bit better at being proactive on the front end so that we don't have as many of those statistical cases on this end that you're now receiving as a medical director. Mm-hmm. So how do we do better work in-house before they end up being 30s and 40s and leaving us too soon because their souls have been fractured and injured so badly? How do we nip that in the bud a little quicker?
How do we do that? How do we get the outreach message? Is it, again, personal work, or what were your thoughts on that?
Well, I'm going to use Nancy's answers. It's both an and.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think, when it comes to substance abuse, a lot of times the religious views are simple condemnation, and it's never helpful because as we see more and more, this is a mental health issue. It is a spiritual issue because we're spiritual beings and should be proactively addressed by spiritual leadership or churches or congregations or temples. But we refrain from that, or rather shun people themselves who fall into those traps, if it is a trap. Habits of any sort are equally worthy of condemnation. It doesn't have to be alcoholism. It doesn't have to be substance abuse. It could be simple abusive language. But because we treat it differently, people who use abusive language, they are okay in church, but people who drink alcohol, they may not be. And why is that? So we have to address it from that perspective of treating the individual equally, whatever their habit or malpractice may be in this personal self-destructive way, and love them still and treat them with that sense of, or bring that sense of reconciliation to them, that they are forgivable, they are acceptable, and forgivable not in the sense as if they have offended me, because if you're destroying yourself, yes, in the large picture you are offending humanity as well, because you are part of us. Yet on the other hand, not offending me as in personally, because you are pursuing some habit that I disagree with. And I think those disagreements should be dealt with a sense of respect and acceptance for people, love for people who are, again, I use the word falling. Maybe they don't feel like they're falling. I feel like they're falling into a trap of addiction. But once we accept them and proactively reach out to them and give them this message of, you're welcome here. I'm going to sit in your company. You're welcome in this company, even if and when you are in your addictive state. You're welcome to this company. But when we don't do that and we shun them, it's self-destructive all the way, unfortunately.
Thank you for saying that. It's so it's so important for acceptance and for authenticity. And as chaplains, the unshockability of hearing a story, right? We have to be unshockable and just be accepting as we hear these stories of brokenness and woundedness and trauma. And we absorb a lot when we're hearing these stories and sitting with this brokenness in the world. but yet to let that love flow and that acceptance flow, and you're not too far to be reconciled. You're not too far to be you don't need to be shunned or ostracized. You're welcome here. That welcoming of the divine, that welcoming of the authentic person.
You were just talking about the shockable story. There are many actually, enough, I would say, that sit within us, difficult stories. You spoke about your mother. I didn't know if you all had any other stories, maybe a story of a spiritual situation or a situation around the dying process that was striking to you, kind of just for certain, whatever reasons you can conceive of. But any particular story from a spiritual standpoint that you think resonates on a lot of these points? It might be a tougher one to think of.
I guess you're addressing the shockability part of it.
Yeah, I think, we get what you were just saying about we absorb. I think it's one of the big parts in hospice. I spend time in the hospital and things like that. The absorption is not the same. It's a very intense world, so you're very kind of on, a heightened state all the time. But you're also in a self-protective mode. I don't know necessarily that you're absorbing unless a certain particular case hits you hard. Some do. But with hospice, each story is so individualized, and you spend time, and I do spend time talking with patients and families, and the stories, they come into you. And some are very painful, and some are very shockable, the shockability, like you said. So yeah, a little bit from that aspect of a story that really impacted you, or something where you thought, this was a pretty significant case.
So I think a lot of times when people feel that they have been shunned or ostracized from their families because of their lifestyle, whatever that was, or an addiction that they had, and then as a spiritual care provider, when you make that first visit and allow them to express that anger that they have towards everybody, including the chaplain, because the chaplain represents those people that rejected this individual. Allow them to vent. Give them the 2 listening ears you have and shut your mouth and listen. That allows the person to actually overcome their own shock of somebody actually loves me. And so the shockability to me in these cases is that there's an extra effort of giving of love, the presence that you have to allow them to continue to vent as if you were the one who shunned them, as if you individually, personally told them they couldn't be loved, and be present and allow your own spirituality. It is like shock, going through, and the pain that you are enduring for the sake of love. And you are willing to do that. And then the other side of that is the shockability on the patient side, where they are amazed that they are loved and come across. It's beautiful to see when they can. It doesn't always happen, but when they can come across to the other side of what I'm seeing as the other side of being loved and being accepted and feeling the freedom that they can talk about whatever they need to talk about.
I think we've all had those stories, and one of them is that we're wired for it. So I'm always reminded of that movie with the long mile. Remember Michael? You know who I'm talking about?
I know who you're talking about.
His last name's gone out of my mind, but he said he took in all of her pain in that scene where she goes into the room with the woman with cancer, and then he walks outside, right, and he blows all of that black, nasty particles into the air, releasing all of the dark. And I think when we deal with the shockability stories that you and Nancy were just speaking to, and Stanley has reported on so well, we do that all the time. That's a routine for chaplains, to go in and sit with some very, very deep and dark stories. And then how do we go home and still do the right self-care to be present with our own families and do life and step back into life that is ours to live out, and then still show up the next morning and be ready to rock and roll and move into the next set of stories that we might have that have shockability issues with them. And how do you do this decade after decade? You're wired for it. We talked about God and creator and divine spirituality within us. And I think God has a calling on our lives for us to be able to go in and do the holding and the loving that it takes to cure those shockability
I
stories.
believe that. I believe that a few things. I believe hospice is a calling. I believe that chaplaincy is a calling. I believe a lot of things where you give of yourself to the extent that we're required to do, it has to take on a spiritual level, because we do absorb so much. And then to be able to release that, you must be spiritually plugged in somehow to be able to release, because otherwise the burnout can be very significant. That's a very, very important thing. So the chaplaincy, how did you all individually come to the point of wanting to do this? I know it was a calling, but what brought you to this role, each of you?
Well, for me, I was in the clinical laboratory, and I was raised in a medical family, and persons in the hospital would come to me and just want me to pray with them and tell me their stories. And so it was kind of in the middle of my life when I left that first career into the ministry career of going to seminary and becoming a chaplain. And so instead of going into a patient's room with needles and vacuumeters and ready to take blood to go analyze it, I was going in with my heart and my Bible and my ears to hear and my love. And so there was a transition, but it was a definite calling. And when I shared that with my pastor, he said, "Oh, I can so see you doing that." Just so see you doing that. And so it was natural for me. But I'll let everybody else tell their story. But then I think another follow-up question is, what are the spiritual practices we do to unburden our souls?
Yeah.
And that would be a question after everyone has.
Oh yeah,
had
I'd
a
like to hear
chance.
that too. Actually, that's actually very valuable for any practitioner of medicine, I think, and anybody clinically, and if you're clinically oriented, because you engage with humanity, and the burdens of humanity are so great. Stanley, what brought you? Yeah, we'll come back to that. I think it's a great question. Tell us about your journey coming to the chaplaincy.
Sure. I think, again, as a fourth grader, I know in fourth grade when, the teacher goes around the room asking, what would you like to become when you grow up? And I said, I would like to become a priest, not knowing what it entailed or what it meant. Now, I come from a family of clergy people, so it kind of made sense now that I look back at it, why I might have said that. And being an old soul as a younger person, I was always more connected to people who had life experience. And so chaplaincy is the medium for me, or the mode for me. Again, I take for granted the calling to ministry, as I said, because in fourth grade I had already said that. So I have no qualms about that I was called. I'm sure of that. And yet, the chaplaincy mode was the place where I didn't have to preach from a pulpit. I don't have to tell you how to live. I'm here to learn from how you have lived and journey with you, if you'll allow me to live my life and maybe find some common places between the two experiences of life. So that's, to me, my attraction towards chaplaincy.
That's beautiful. Yeah, that's beautiful. And Deb, what about you?
Well, similarly to Stanley, I actually have always felt a very deep divine connection to God through my prayer life since I was age 8. So I have always felt like a spiritual being from the very beginning, moving through. But I also noticed as an observer, old soul, you use the term, but I observed a lot as a child, and I watched church and family not really completely match up with the book of Luke. And I struggled throughout my teens with this love Nancy speaks of, not being really authentic and real. When a divorced woman is no longer welcomed at the church, these kind of things going on in the 70s, and I'm going, there's something very off here. So through a lot of deep prayer and continued to really walk Pensacola Beach for a lot of miles, I felt called to go from photojournalism, where I was going to capture stories through photographs. I went and talked to my preacher about me becoming a minister, and I was told I could marry a minister, but I will never myself be a minister. So God and I had another conversation, and I went to Florida State and got my social work degree. So I share all that part of the story to say I have always gone back to my social work duties as the best education of being able to sit with the wounded, the broken, the down and out, the lost, the crisis, the traumas that I experienced as a social worker on duty. It prepped me for pastoral care work as a chaplain. It absolutely was the best education I could have ever gotten. So that pastor's no was God's way of saying, let's do a yes. And the yes is social work. And it leads you into the next best step. So the academics definitely have to come into play, but so does the constant calling that there's a better way to be a spiritual being moving in this world, doing the physicalities and the challenges and the sufferings and the losses. We can do this better. You mentioned in my bio, I'm a certified Enneagram. I'm a 1 on that Enneagram. Ones want to reform the world. Ones see a lot of systems that have cracks, and they know that there's a way to tweak it. If they could just move the gears just a little bit, we might be able to get to a closer perfection. I've had to come on the other side and recognize there's something beautiful about imperfection. So, not to tear up here, but as a chaplain, I sit with the broken and I see beauty, and I see it as a privilege.
That's utterly beautiful. I do too. I actually come by way of always having thought that the beauty was in, I never called it imperfection or perfection. I like authenticity. And I love people who come by way of authenticity to a beautiful place of self-love, but appreciation for others, open attitude. I love that. That's like my favorite storyline, which is probably what motivates me is how do we give that authenticity to the dying process, whereas because so many people are fractured, broken, and not prepared and in such pain that it's not going to be an easy process because the work wasn't done before or the acknowledgement wasn't received. And I'm positive that the divine gives us signs and things like that, but that's not an easy thing to come by when you're in dire, dire places. Talking a little bit, let's go back to that question. We do need to address it. It's important. How do you unburden yourself when you are absorbing all that kind of pain and grief, the wounds of the world? How does one unburden oneself?
Well, there are various ways, spiritual practices. There are lots of different spiritual practices. For the longest time, I would go to the beach and let the waves wash over my feet and imagine all the burdens going out to sea. There's a prayer that happens, a relinquishment of the burdens and the prayer that I'm sending these burdens out to sea. Then I learned about spiritual direction, and I took 2 years of spiritual direction training. And spiritual direction is a place to unburden my soul. So once a month, I meet with a spiritual director, and then I have directees that meet with me. And there are more burdens that I hear, but once a month, I have an appointment to unburden my soul with my spiritual director. And then other practices during the month, practices of prayer, or you can even just wash your hands. And as you're washing your hands, just release those things. And with the healthcare system, we have to wash our hands between everything. So why not make washing hands a spiritual practice?
I love that. I do personally make a lot of things a spiritual practice, and not not in an insane way, but I believe in that. I believe in the rituals, the small rituals that are meaningful. A cup of tea, or just sitting outside and stilling yourself and not speaking. There is spirituality or divinity in everything. Stanley, you tell us how you do it, how you remain so zen.
I attempt to. Well, I think, I am an introvert in reality, but my profession helps me to be expressive. And when I am in the mode of chaplaincy and having to express, it's actually a release for me. Because normally I'm an introvert and I hold on to everything that I am thinking about. My wife usually will ask me, "What you thinking about?" And I don't know what to say. It's hard, the mind is always racing and thinking, but what do you say? And so chaplaincy is a mode where I'm able to actually feel that release. And I am at a stage of life where I didn't grow up with liturgy. So liturgy is another release for me. But again, it's in the mode of chaplaincy or as a minister that when I am performing, if I may use that word, liturgy, when I am celebrating the Eucharist, it is a release for me. This is what I was called to do, and I'm getting to fulfill my calling. There's no better release for me than that. Now, outside of all the spiritual practices, which are very healthy and necessary for us to be able to release all the shockability and burdens that we receive from people because they're willing to share with us, is just sit down. And I'm OCD as well. Not diagnosed, so not making light of it, but at the same time, very compulsive about behaviors. If that glass is just out of place, I usually would have moved it or something like that. And so I practice not being compulsive about things. My wife puts forks and spoons all over the place, and I practice to live with it. And that's another release for me to allow myself to be freed from what compulsions I have. So when I've received the burdens, I find it easier to let go because I don't have to hold on to these. In the moment of my ministry or my serving an individual or a family, I'm fully present, fully attending, fully receiving everything they want to give me. At the moment that I have left that place, I can release that. It is not my burden to carry anymore. It is their burden, but they were willing to share with me. I'm actively releasing it. Sometimes I just scream in the car. If that helps as an answer.
I've heard that one before. not you.
I had a
usually have my
friend who
windows
was
rolled.
a chaplain who did kickboxing, just something like that. So back to you.
And Deb,
Well,
how do you?
I said I was a deep prayer, and I am. So I journal my prayers. I go out in nature and walk and have conversations in prayer. And prayer is a huge journey for me in releasing. When I was working in the ER as a chaplain, I found myself, and I do shower more than this. I was about to say I shower every night. But when you're working in the ER, there was a ritual for me to let go of all the trauma of the day, the amount of car accidents that happened and situations that entered in. I would go home every day and bathe and let the shower take away the day. And then I would go downstairs and I would be present with my family and leave that ER behind in those ER days. But I think spiritual practices are exactly what everyone said. It is a cup of tea. It is sitting down, having a cup of coffee, and petting your favorite little pet. I have a brand new little puppy. And so there's this appreciation of touching nature and creatures and critters and just appreciating that life does go on. Life continues to move around us, and we've got to step back in and engage with it. And that itself makes life its own prayer. It's a living prayer.
I love that. I love that. It's a reminder. Well, I just wanted to say thank you to each of you. I feel like we've had a very good conversation today, and I really appreciate your insights. There's so much more. I was thinking for everything you said, I could easily expound on it or go on, but in the interest of time, I'll wrap it up today, I guess. So thank you so much for watching. And if you like this episode, we will be posting episodes every Tuesday at 3 on various platforms. I have my blog, the palliativepost.com, to go to. And then there will be products available through a merchandise shop, so we can post the link on that. If there's any interest in any of the guests, please let me know also. All of them are wonderful speakers and very, very brilliant people. So thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.